It may be because what we've been going through this week, dealing with a new level, a new issue of suffering or of a crisis, it has made the book of Job and study of it a little fresher, a little more personal. But as we said from our very beginning, the study in the book of Job is about real life. It's about who we all are. There's not a one of us who hasn't at some time been in that situation when the crisis came. We defined the idea of grief, the emotion of grief, as the human response for dealing with loss. And I would suggest by introduction tonight's lesson, as we think about caregiving to individuals who suffer through a crisis, need to be reminded something of the magnitude of what Job has experienced in the first chapter and the first half of the second chapter. There was that loss of wealth, as all of his worldly possessions, in a sense, his livestock, which was his investment of wealth, along with the servants who took care of them, all but for 4 servants in the picture are destroyed. They're gone. They're stolen, captured, killed, whatever it was. I looked for a parallel for us to think about. It's the grief that comes when we lose security. I don't mean to say that in a sinful kind of way, that as Christians we're putting our trust in material possessions. But in life, we do make some plans, don't we? We buy an insurance plan because we anticipate it covering us if something dangerous or significant happens. How do we feel when that company who was underwriting the security goes bankrupt and we lose? What we've lost is a sense of the security we thought we had, the coverage. Same thing true for a medical plan, an investment in a retirement plan. When that kind of tragedy comes, that loss, the grief we feel, is a loss of some security. Then he lost his family. All 10 of his children are killed in this giant wind that comes through. Reminds me of the Drecos that we had here, and then in an even greater sense it came through the Midwest and through central Indiana. Just straight line winds, 90, 95 miles an hour, and it toppled the house where all 10 of the children were having a feast. And they were all killed, all servants except that one who was able to come deliver the bad news. That's a loss of relationship, and we mourn the losses of relationships. It can be grief that comes through the empty nest, when the children who've been a focal point of the relationship in the family have joyfully, and with mom and dad's blessing, have married or gone to college, and they've moved out. The house is emptier than it was. And it's a relationship change, but the old relationship is not there, and it's not going to be. Or someone does die, or someone who's been significant moves to another state, and the dynamic of being able to see them frequently, regularly is lost. There's a sense of grief that comes because we've lost a relationship. And then there was the loss of his health, and that's where we left the story last week. He's outside of the city. He has these boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. They, either by pain or itch, necessitate him taking a piece of broken pottery, a potsherd, and he scrapes his skin in order to gain some measure of relief from what it is that he's experiencing. In a sense, when we lose our health, what we've lost is our control, our ability to make the decisions to do what we want to do because now we can't. There's a limitation that blocks us traveling or going or doing or experiencing, or it's the loss of something that's pleasurable to us, that we've always found meaningful. Well, all of those are griefs. They're losses we experience in life. They're losses that people in your family, in your church family, in your neighborhood experience. They're griefs that we're experiencing during this pandemic, because of things that we can't do, things we can't have, things we question the safety of. And so there's a loss. Talk about the new normal, we mourn the old normal. Even though we griped a lot about it 6 months ago, and we said, I don't like the way, we wish we could go back to it because there was a comfort measure, a control we sought to have. Well, that's Job's grief. That's the picture I want you to sense that he's dealing with. So in difficult times, to whom do we turn? Where do we go? And I'm going to suggest 3 things in our text. 2 are specifically in this. One we saw at the end of chapter 1. One is you turn to your family. The family was the original biblical network for people dealing with things. Even when they're driven out of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve have each other. They were given each other because of the loneliness that existed without Eve's presence. And even after you have the death of Abel and the estrangement, in a sense, of Cain, you still have a nuclear family, don't you? And there are other children like Seth who are born to this family of Adam and Eve. The family was the nuclear source for comfort and strength during times of crisis in life. Proverbs 1 and verse 8, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction. Do not forsake your mother's teaching." We see it fleshed out again in Ephesians chapter 6 about bringing up children in the nurture, the admonition of the Lord. It's significant that parents are the number one trainers, instructors of those children. And mothers and fathers instill faith values, and they provide safety. I suppose every child is a little different. Maybe when they're really little, when something negative happens, they want to run to mama. But I see more and more as especially girls get older and something happens in their life, they want to run to their daddy. They want his hug. They want his security. They want to feel that there's protection that is there. And God designed the family in order to meet that kind of need. In 1 Timothy 5, in kind of a warning sense, a negation, it says, "But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own household, he's denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." I believe our first responsibility for being the caregiver, our first responsibility for ministering to people in crisis is our immediate family. I believe that's the way God designed. Doesn't mean that gives us a get-out-of-jail-free card that says, "Oh, I don't have to take care of anybody else's. I don't have to care about anybody else's crisis or their suffering." But it's to recognize that, first off, I can't eliminate the needs that my children and my spouse and my in-laws and that extended earthly family have to say, "Oh, I got to go do something else." Preachers are bad about that. Preachers are really bad about that, of going out and taking care of everybody else's hurts and trying to minister and sometimes neglecting the needs that we have in our own families. You think in the biblical story, there's Naomi and Ruth. This is a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law who are going to experience a bonding through the death of two family members. Ruth loses her husband, who was the son of Naomi, who's already lost her husband. And basically, they're all they have left. And so here they go back to Palestine. And the story of the book of Ruth becomes the story of how two people care for each other in a family. The daughter-in-law who brings back what it is that she earns in gleaning in the fields of Boaz, brings it back so that there's food in the house for both of them to be able to eat. And a mother-in-law who is interested in this daughter-in-law finding one who's going to be her protector, to be her husband, and to be the one who will be the progenitor of her own grandchildren. But it's a family setting, and the whole story is around the idea of family. In the New Testament, it's Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, three family members, two sisters and a brother. And if you wanted to, you could almost put Jesus into the midst of the picture, because Jesus was a friend of the family and was cared for deeply. We can multiply those stories, but I want you to see how true that was to the plan of God, that when crisis comes, the first place, ideally, we have that we turn are to those folks who are a part of our family. In Job's case, it didn't work out so well. Listen to verses 9 and 10 of chapter 2. Then Job's wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity?" All this Job did not sin with his lips. Now, I am quick to warn about judging Mrs. Job too harshly, because when we did our list of grief that Job was experiencing, Mrs. Job was experiencing exactly the same set of grief. All those things that had provided a rather easy lifestyle for her are gone. What's the future going to hold? Think that brought a little anxiety? And those children that died were not just Job's 10 children, they were her 10 children. And my experience, again, as much as we men are touched by a loss of a close family member, a child, there's nothing like what it does to mama. There's nothing like the loss of a person who's carried one in their womb for 9 months and has been the one who's nursed that child. I don't care if they're adults and grown and, having the feast in one of their houses. That's still their baby. And so Mrs. Job experienced that loss as well. And now her husband, instead of being there to help her, guess where he is? He's out in the ash heap scratching himself with a piece of pottery, and he doesn't even look like himself, and she thinks he's probably going to die too. So I cut her some slack for how it is she responds. Not justifying, not saying that makes it healthy. Just before we, think we've got everybody else figured out, realize we haven't been in that position as well. But her advice, instead of being helpful, is, Job, I know you're a man of integrity. You've just said back at the end of chapter 1, blessed be the name of the Lord. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. He says, why don't you just curse him and die? That's going to fit into a bit of the theology that I think was somewhat a part of the world they lived in, certainly amongst some of the friends Job's going to talk to. But her advice didn't help. And it got me to thinking, what are some of the bad things that sometimes we say to hurting people? And that list is quite long, and I've put my foot in my mouth several times. I think the worst, maybe the most hurtful thing that I have ever done is it related to dealing with somebody who lost a loved one. Shortly into my ministry, I would have been probably 25, third year preaching in Cloverdale, and got a call from the funeral director and says, I've got a couple here, and they just had twins, and one of them was stillborn, and they wonder if you'd be willing to do a service for the one that was stillborn. He gave me their names. I went to the hospital to visit the mother, and I walked in, and I said, they've asked me if I would do the funeral for, and I called the one that was still alive instead of the one that had died. And she quickly looked like, what? And I'm sorry, I transposed the names. I'm sorry. Not a great start to ministering to somebody who's in crisis. And we've all done that, and we've probably all had somebody do that to us. I just got to thinking of things that we say. You walk up to somebody and you say, it could be worse. Well, right at that point, they can't even begin to fathom how it could be worse. You haven't been very helpful by telling them it could be worse, because on a scale of 1 to 1,000, it's a 990, so who cares if it's a 991? Or, if I were you, I think I would just give up. Now, you might be inflecting on that to say, if that were me, I think I might just give up. But what you're doing is giving credibility to the very thought that they may be having, just like Job's wife. Why don't you just go ahead and curse God and die? Why don't I just go on and give everything up? Walk out on my family. I can't deal with this crisis. Or, again, one I'm sure I've said a dozen times, I know how you feel. And I'm generally saying that because, I lost a grandparent, and so I think I can empathize right closely with somebody who's a teenager who just lost their first grandparent. But you see, I don't care how similar your situation was to their situation, it's not just as they feel. You don't know how close they were. You don't know how guilty they feel. You don't know. There's so many things you don't know. So just say, I know you must feel terrible. And you can relate. I recall when but don't draw the comparison. Or, this is a good family comparison kind of thing. Why can't you just deal with life's problems like your sister? My guess is that represents what has been a lifetime of comparisons. Why don't you make good grades like your sister? Why aren't you pretty like your sister? Why can't you drive better than your sister? And even though all four of those statements could be totally accurate, they're not very helpful. Not very helpful at all. And again, the list could be extensive. The point is, as a caregiver, think before you speak. If you're going to say something, run it through your head and imagine how that's going to sound when it comes out of your mouth. If you think, a lot of the things that we put our foot in our mouth about simply never would come in. It's a bad choice of words. Just not good. Well, in difficult times, we turn to family. Secondly, we turn to our friends. There's that beautiful story in the Old Testament about David and Jonathan. I always like it, not just because it's a beautiful picture of friendship, and I've been blessed with some extraordinarily good friendships from high school to college and on through all of my preaching ministry, friends who care about me. But there's something special about Jonathan's heart, because Jonathan is the son of the existing King Saul, would have, by all rights, I guess we would say, not rights because God wasn't going to put him there, but by all legal precedent, he would have been king. But he is willing to give up the throne willingly, without a fight, in order for David, who he understands to be God's anointed. At the same time, Jonathan is loyal to his father Saul, and he ultimately goes off into war with him and dies in battle. But David and Jonathan had a heart-tugging relationship with each other. And I think it's a great picture of so many passages. Proverbs, again, 17:17, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. Two passages out of Proverbs 27, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. Do not forsake your own friend or your father's friend. Do not go to your brother's house in the day of your calamity. Better is a neighbor who is near than a brother far away. Friends, people who we know love us, not because in a sense they have to like family, but because they want to, because they care about us. Well, here's the passage that deals with Job's friends. Now, when Job's three friends heard of all his adversity, I would not suggest Job only had three friends. The fourth one's going to show up later. I'm sure he had more than that. The three friends are referenced here because they're the three who make this trip and become a part of this story. So when Job's three friends heard of all this adversity that had come upon him, they came, each one from his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite, and they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and comfort him. We'll look at those three guys in a little more individual detail as we work through the book and try to pigeonhole where it is they may have come from and how far they might have traveled. And when they lifted up their eyes at a distance and did not recognize him, they raised their voices and wept. And each of them tore his robe, and they threw dust over their heads toward the sky. They sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, with no one speaking a word to him, for they saw that his pain was very great. What did Job's friends do as you try to summarize what that text is? The first part here is their best evidence at caregiving. They heard of Job's tragedy, and they determined to come sympathize and comfort. I think the three of them heard messages, and the messengers who had brought the news carried back and forth very quickly. It's not like they had a cell phone to make an appointment and said, let's go tomorrow morning. But they determined to come to him and to arrive together to do two things: to sympathize and to comfort. And I truly believe that as friends, when we seek to minister to the people who are going through crisis in their lives, Our job is to sympathize or empathize, if you like the word a bit better. It means to feel what they feel. And when they see him, they begin to feel what at least they perceive that he feels. And then to be able to comfort. Sympathy has to do with understanding. Comfort has to do with assuaging. It's putting oil on a cut. It's putting an anti-itch on an itch. It's offering what a person needs in the midst of their hurt. Sympathy helps you understand the hurt so you know how to minister. It's what they're doing to Pam. They're diagnosing what the problem is so they know what to be able to do. And that's our challenge, to be able to sympathize and comfort. They felt his grief. And I say that because look at what they do. They wept, they lifted up their voices loudly, they tore their garments, they threw dust in the air. Couldn't help, Aubrey, but think it's a little different scene than the riot that was described in our text last week in the book of Acts, where these rioters were picking up dust, throwing it in the air. Now, it's the same, a cultural response to strong emotion. That was anger. This is sorrow. This is a sharing of grief. And so, in our work that we do with people, we try to find those cultural means by which we can plug into a person's life. There's been a change in my 40 years plus of full-time work. There was a time when you didn't talk about sex. You didn't talk about immorality in public. Now it's everywhere. I mean, it's as public as anything that you'll find, advertisements on TV, news reports. But back then you talked about death. And now death is the silent subject. People get uncomfortable when you say, we're going to talk about death and dying. And so our cultural responses have changed. The number of people who visit a funeral home, who go to a funeral, the number of flowers that are sent. I'm not suggesting that that's a bad change. I'm just wondering what we changed to in order to still have a cultural picture of empathy and sharing with people. I used to know that you could send, what then was a $10 spray of flowers, and by sending them, you said in unmistakable terms, that person was important. You're important. We care about you. As we diminish those cultural norms, and some then view even the sending of the flowers not being meaningful at all, counterproductive. Why wait? It's just harder for us to find those ways to let people know. We'll touch on some things I think that always work in a minute. Here's some insights that might be useful to us as caregivers. Oh, I forgot one down there. They sat for a week with him in silence. That's going to be kind of significant as we go through the next set of verses. But they spend a week sensing how strong his pain was, and they're willing to just sit there and be with him. Well, insight number one for caregivers is remember your presence is more important than your conversation. I'm not suggesting conversation is unimportant. I'm just saying that the fact that you cared enough to do something or to be there with them is an extraordinarily important piece to sharing comfort and sympathizing with a person. Touch and listening are good points of contact and comfort. Now, they listened. I don't think Job was saying much till we get to chapter 3 and his lament next week because it was in silence. But in a sense, they were listening to the nonverbal power of hurt. And sometimes you will learn where an individual is by just sitting with them for a little while and listening to them talk. They may not even on the surface want to talk about what's going on that's so painful in their life, but you're going to find out how agitated they are. You're going to sense whether they've been crying a lot. You're going to sense how angry they are. And they may express their anger at that stupid cat in the house, but in reality, your perception lets you know their anger is really rooted in something a lot deeper. It's in the trouble they're facing, in the family crisis that they're dealing with. Touch and listening are points of contact with people. Thirdly, I think it's important for people to know that we express our own grief with them. And again, if there's a cultural way that that can be done, if they see us cry, I think I always thought, as the preacher, I wasn't supposed to ever cry. Well, now you're stuck with the fact I do, and if I don't acknowledge that, I might as well quit what I'm doing because as I've gotten older, I guess can't block those emotions quite as well as I used to. Pam said all along, people would like to see you be emotional. They don't find comfort from a stoic. They don't find a comfort from the person who's got it all together and never had to deal with anything that was hard. They don't mind seeing you flustered and frustrated. They don't mind seeing you cry. And so Job's friends come, and they do just, in a sense, what he's been doing. They grieve with him, and they openly express that grief. So I think it's important for us to let other people see that in us. And always keep in mind that you do not fully understand the situation. You just, as much as it's tempting to talk a little while and think you've kind of sorted it out, and you've got this little diagram in your mind, and here's my strategy. Just realize you don't understand all of it. Sometimes you don't understand how close the relationship was with the person who's deceased. It could be an aunt or an uncle. It could be their dog. And if you're not a dog lover, it's real easy to be pretty insensitive when somebody, you mean you're upset about a dog? Yeah, because that may have been the closest relationship they had. They may not have a network of friends that you do, and they may not have family connections that are as safe and non-threatening and non-demanding and unconditional. See, a pet gives unconditional love. That's what bonds you to your pet. It's there for you. It loves you. And so don't think that you've mastered the situation. You don't understand sometimes that the loss comes from a guilt. Oh, I wish I had just gone on over there Friday. Oh, I wish I had just made one more phone call. Oh, I remember I said such and such. And you can't imagine that they would have ever neglected or not done something. Yeah, but they do. And so as you minister, as you're a caregiver, not just in the 2 days surrounding an immediate tragedy, but as you're the friend who is the caregiver for the next year, be open to understanding special dates that surface and that recreate some of the pain, like pulling the Band-Aid back off. Yeah, it's healed, but it hurts so bad when that anniversary comes, or that birthday, or the event that took their life. Or it doesn't have to be a death. It can be losing a job, it can be retiring, it can be moving. Any of those things. Just be humble as a caregiver and not arrogant as a caregiver. Family, friends, but ultimately it is our imperfection at being an earthly caregiver. Job's wife and Job's friends are kind of going to fail the test. And so I'm reminding all of us, to whom do we turn in times of difficulty? God. God. And that's what makes Job's responses at the end of chapter 1 and here in chapter 2 in response to what his wife said so significant. Because Job, in the midst of his own pain, which is as real and evident as a text can paint it, never loses sight of and connection with God. In that opening thing was, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. He may have some flaws in some of his theological grasping, but he viewed God as a giver. God could be a taker. God was God to him. And nothing was going to turn his heart away from God. And in this case, he says, we receive good from God, and can't we accept adversity? Again, we'll explore some of the shallowness of his theology about pain and suffering. What I want you to see, his immediate response when suffering came wasn't to push God away. It wasn't to quit coming to church. It wasn't to quit praying. It wasn't to throw the Bible in the trash. His immediate response was, God is God. And I'm with God because that's who He is. Not because of what He's given me, not because of, that's the whole issue with what Satan has put before God. And he says, the only reason Job serves you is because you've made him rich and prosperous and healthy, and you take all those things away, and he'll curse you to his face. He did not. Because Job proved what I want us to prove in our lives, that God is God. And we don't have to understand everything behind an event in order to keep God at the center of our life. 2 Corinthians 1, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our afflictions, so that we will be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. We kind of have to first experience what it is to have God help us through a tough spot before we can really understand what it is to help somebody else through a tough spot. So we have family, and we have friends, and we have God. They're all important. I've tried to have an observation for you to take away. When we finish the series up, I'll print all of what will probably be about a dozen observations. That'll be your keepsake, your takeaway from our walking through the book again. Tonight's observation is this: develop a good support team. I know the emphasis of our lesson has been on being a caregiver. How do you take care and minister to somebody else? But the bottom line is the book of Job is personally directed to our dealing with our own adversity. I think it's crucial that while we're living our lives, we develop a good support team. Now, hopefully you got some folks in there who have blood kin with you, or at least in-law kin with you. I mean, they're family, and they're there. And you trust them with your life, you listen to their advice, you never outgrow, that relationship that is family. Make that a part of your support team. Some of you got some family members who you don't need to talk to when crisis comes. They're not going to be helpful. They're not going to be godly. They're not going to give you faith-based advice. They're not going to lift you up. Because you could hear on my list of bad things to say in those situations, you could hear some of your family saying some of those things. Doesn't mean you don't love them. It doesn't mean you wouldn't do anything for them. It just means they're not going to be a part of this team. Your support team are people who you know and you trust are going to be there for you. And then have those friends. Again, we got some friends, that's not who I'd call. I laughed when Mark Adams was here. Mark called me down to the office one day and he said, Don, I just got this really odd email. I said, what is it? He said, well, there's this guy. He said, I barely know him from grad school. I do know who he is, but we've hardly ever talked. And he just sent me this email that says that he was in England and he had lost his passport and he needed $200 to help apply for his passport in order to get back to the U.S., and he needed to get back and gave some other reason. He says, do you think I ought to send him some money? I said, think through this, okay? First of all, if you were in that situation, who is the last person you would call? A preacher and somebody who just got out of grad school with $50,000 education debt to send you $200? That doesn't make any sense. Well, there's some people who are not going to be supportive. They're not going to have the resources to help you. But you need to have that team of people in mind, and you need to have that relationship with God in place. When tragedy comes, it'll challenge our faith. And if you've allowed your faith to grow weak and your relationship with God weak, it's hard to keep your footing when the storm comes. But if your faith is where it needs to be, you'll be unmoved because you'll turn to the right place, to the giver of all good gifts, to God Himself. Well, next week, if you want to read ahead, look at chapter 3. After 7 days of sitting there with his friends, Job opens his mouth. And I want to talk about the place for lament. Aubrey addressed this a little bit in one of his lessons the other day on faith. But it's okay. It's okay to lament. It's okay to speak out loud about how bad something is. And we'll analyze a bit of Job's response to that. As we sing our invitation hymn this evening, I want to remind you of this picture we painted, that it's important for us to pick out those people who are going to be helpful to us in times of need. And ultimately, that's kind of what an invitation always is. It's an invitation for you to make sure that your choice of the Lord is right. That you love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That there is no one who's greater than Him. There is no God but the God of heaven. And that you have accepted His invitation and you have confessed your faith before men and you've experienced the joy of a new birth as you're buried and raised in Christ with all the spiritual blessings that are in Christ. Maybe this evening there's somebody listening to us who's a part of this class via Facebook, and you've been thinking about your life and you've been thinking, I don't know how would I turn to God in times of disaster? That's true. It's because there's something missing in that relationship. And you need to build your support team by obeying Him and getting your life right with Him. If you're in the audience tonight as we sing this hymn and there's a need that you have that you'd like to bring in prayer, if it has to do with your relationship with the Lord, we'd love to be able to sit and talk to you and pray about it this evening. If you're online and you need to talk to us, you know those contacts. You know how to reach us. Leave us a message, and we'll reach back to you. We'll help you find your support team in the Lord. You need to come, do, while we stand.